This is Duke University.
So first of all, I would like to say welcome to everybody. I'm Giovanni Zanalda, and I'm co-chairing with this Globalization Governance Development University Seminar Series with Gary Gereffi. And Gary will tell you more about our honorable speakers. I want just briefly say thank you very much to all our supporters, in particular to the Africa Initiative, that is co-sponsoring this particular workshop with us. And then DUCES, which is the Duke University Center for International Studies, the U.S. Department of Education, the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Strategies and Programs. And now, Gary, it's your turn.
Thanks very much, Giovanni. And let me also thank all of you for coming to this seminar. The DUCES seminar this year has been focusing on Africa and different topics. And for this particular seminar, we really wanted to look more closely at African agriculture because it's one of the most dynamic areas of development in Africa. And we have a very kind of special opportunity to tell a story about a research project that's pretty unique. The seminar is called Realizing the Potential of African Agriculture, but it's really about a project that was focusing on the 10 leading agricultural innovations in sub-Saharan Africa over the past century, which is a very daunting sort of topic. And the reason we came to this topic last year was because the Rockefeller Foundation was having its centennial last year. It wanted to focus on this particular theme of agricultural innovations in sub-Saharan Africa. And to do that, it asked for some collaboration with a couple of other research and development groups. So one of those groups is OXFAM America, very well known for its work in the food security and nutrition area, but more broadly as a development NGO. And the other group was the Center on Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness here at Duke University that I direct, and one of the panelists, Ajmal, is from that center. So the collaboration last year was Rockefeller asking OXFAM America and CGGC if those two units could try to help identify the 10 leading agricultural innovations from a much bigger list of about 150 or 880. So Ajmal and Kimberly might describe a little bit about that process. But what resulted from that was a report that came out, talked about these innovations, and then a major conference in Abuja, Nigeria, last July. And that was the culminating event, and the results of that conference are on Rockefeller's website, OXFAM's website, and we'll also have it on Duke's website. So in holding this event, what we wanted to try to do was to bring together some of the pieces of that effort. And in particular, we wanted to try to bring some of a flavor of those agricultural innovations to Duke. And we tried very hard to actually increase the panel by bringing in some of the African nationals who were also involved in that conference. And because of schedule problems, we couldn't get some of the people here we wanted, but we still have a great panel with 3 people who represent different aspects of the project. So what I want to do is just introduce who our panelists are, and then each of them will tell you more about their piece of the project, and we want to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So the first panelist, the one who will lead us off, is Kimberly Pfeifer, who is the research director at OXFAM America. So OXFAM is a big international NGO, and OXFAM America is one of the components, and they were the ones involved in this project with Rockefeller and CGGC. Before joining OXFAM, Kimberly worked for the AFL-CIO as a researcher in their Center for Strategic Research. She has both MA and PhD degrees from the University of Florida in political science and African studies. But Kimberly also worked for the Aga Khan Foundation in Zanzibar, Tanzania. And recently she has been getting into the blogosphere. She just showed us a recent blog that she did where she engaged with New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, talking about the challenge to academia and researchers more generally in trying to get engaged in relevant policy debates. So I think this session will be an example of one of those relevant policy debates, and we'll see whether or not the kind of research that will be discussed here meets the high bar that Kristof and Kimberly are pointing us to. Second panelist that I want to introduce is Ajmal Abdulsamad, who's to my right. Ajmal is a researcher at the Center on Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness, and our offices are just next to East Campus by Irwin Mill in something called the Gray Building, and we've been around for 10 years. Ajmal got his degree from, one of his more recent degrees, a Master in International Development Policy here at Duke. And he worked for over 10 years as a project manager working with international organizations and UN development agencies in Afghanistan. So he brings a lot of on-the-ground experience as well as research experience. And Ajmal was really the leader of the Duke CGGC team in collaborating with OXFAM America and pulling together the empirical research you're going to hear about. And then finally, we're really pleased to have Peter Bolt with us. Peter Bolt is managing director and founder of an organization called DADTCO, Dutch Agricultural Development and Trading Company. But Peter is also very important because he was one of the inventors or innovators of one of those 10 agricultural innovations that was considered particularly influential, which focused on cassava and mobile processing units for cassava, and Peter will tell you about that. But I think when I think of Peter's background, several things come to mind. I mean, agronomist, kind of engineer, entrepreneur. He joins these things. He has spent 42 years in Africa and counting. He lives in Nigeria most of the time. So
God's own holiday country.
Okay. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to turn the floor over first to Kimberly, then to Ajmal, then to Peter. They all know how much time they have, so I'll let them sort of try to summarize a rich amount of information, and then we'll try to leave plenty of time for questions and comments from the audience. So without any further ado, Kimberly, let me ask you to start us off.
Thank you. Let me make sure everyone can hear. Yeah, great. In case you aren't familiar with OXFAM's work, I'll just briefly say that we are an international development and humanitarian assistance agency. We work in about 92 countries, and we work in a number of ways. We are a partner-based organization. We have new countries, and it also involves advocacy, policy work, and campaigning on various issues that we work on. I have the control. Let's see. Great. But you also, as Gary was suggesting, may know us very well as a hunger and food security organization. So I'm going to start at that point with today's conversation, give you a feel for OXFAM's perspective on these issues and how we came about to working with Rockefeller and CGGC on this project, and just give you a flavor for what came out of that project. And as Gary said, why do this kind of work? So 1 in 8 people will go to bed hungry tonight, and that's nearly 3 times the population of the United States. 98% of these hungry people live in the developing world, and half of them are from smallholder farming communities. And so OXFAM believes that smallholder farmers not only have a right to food, but have a right to a sustainable livelihood and stand to gain from investment in agriculture. And henceforth, why we have put a lot of our attention and effort into programming around agricultural issues and as they relate to global food security. And And we see smallholder farmers as part of that solution, part of the solution of achieving global food security. In particular, smallholder farmers are a big part of the solution to achieving not only global food security, but growing economies in Africa. 63% of sub-Saharan African population lives in rural areas. 62% of the sub-Saharan population is employed in agriculture, it is estimated. And about 80% of all farms in sub-Saharan Africa are smallholder farms. So OXFAM believes, given this reality, that it's critical to support smallholder farmers. Sorry. For you. So OXFAM believes, given this reality, it's important access to and develop innovations in agriculture and food production. And this is what attracted us in the Rockefeller proposal when they came to us to work on these issues. But very quickly, let me just touch upon the smallholder farmers. There's a sorry, I keep changing on the wrong place. Framework for our market systems approach, but support to collective organization, building assets, integrated risk management, and then increasing smallholder power along agricultural value chains. And here what you're seeing is our market systems approach to our work in agriculture, and more generally, our work even beyond agriculture to working to develop pro-poor markets. So from our perspective, there's a triangle of critical actors and a set of relations that go along with that then, of course, OXFAM and other actors and to benefit from these gains into those relationships. But we see government, civil society, and private sector actors all as having key relationships in increasing farmers' access to markets. This is just, again, a conceptual framework for our integrated risk management programming. But let me go ahead and skip ahead and talk a little bit about this project that we did with CGGC and Rockefeller Foundation. So the Rockefeller Foundation last year celebrated their centennial. And as they wanted to reflect on their work in agriculture over the years, the accomplishments or achievements they've made in collaboration with various actors across the globe. And approached OXFAM and CGGC with the idea of doing a scan of the most promising innovations across agricultural value chains in Africa that improve access to finance, market access, and integration in and how to imagine taking those promising innovations to scale. So they approached us and we said, that sounds like a great project that we should be working on. And the idea here was to develop this work for one of their centennial events. They were holding a high-level summit in Abuja, Nigeria, where they were bringing together policymakers, they were bringing ministers of agriculture and ministers of finance together to have open, honest conversations with one another in a big public forum with civil society, private sector actors, and but it was quite a powerful convening, and they asked the ministers to even get sort of the span of the GGC in a set of about 6 months, I believe, Ajmal, if even that, right? And we wanted to do it with some rigor, and that's tough. I'm sure, as all researchers here at Duke, take some promising innovations, and I'll let Ajmal talk a little about how we developed that conceptual framework and did that. But I'll try to innovations that ended up being the we chose just by flipping at least through some of the pictures. The key findings coming out of that summit, those broad discussions with ministers of agriculture and finance from, I believe it was 9 countries across Africa, along with civil society, private sector representatives, and as I said, even farmers. And the 8 innovations that ended up being featured there, Peter Bolt was one of those that joined us there. So I'm going to start with constraints because it is always very easy to get people to tell you what's wrong, what's the problem. And that was indeed the case even at this summit. And so here's the list of what's wrong. What are the constraints for smallholder farmers? There's a lack of access to credit and affordable finance, a lack of inadequate access to information, environment in terms of the right institutions, inadequate private sector investment, challenge of aggregation, low skill educational levels, lack of knowledge, inadequate government budgets to invest in agriculture, and then also an infrastructure conundrum. Youth have a lack of voice in agriculture discussions, lack of trust, unfair import competition as a result of lack of supportive policies, and finally, tariffs. And the struggle was getting people to sit down and talk about what are some of the solutions, what are some of the things we can do, what are some of the successes or promising things, just like the innovations we hoped would help spur this creative sense of what's going on, exciting in Africa. To support and scale the success of some of the exciting innovations that are happening. And some of the key findings from that were that one, you can't farm without finance. And so smallholders was going to be critical. And also getting the finance and agricultural ministers to talk with one another around the kind of investment decisions that had to be made between agriculture and finance ministers was critical. A second was that farmer organization is key. It's very difficult to access smallholder farmers have difficulty accessing markets because it's very difficult to also access smallholder farmers. And key in that is to be able to aggregate their production. Peter will talk a little bit about this issue. A third is policy matters. So supportive public policies play a critical role in helping smallholders to upgrade and access markets. Innovations like technology specifically are only context. Another was that small market access is enhanced by innovations that promote greater social and economic sustainability. That innovations must adapt to or address local conditions to benefit smallholders, and that finally success with innovations requires partnerships. If there was one thing we heard a lot at the summit, turning and hoping Ajmal will confirm this too, is the need for partnerships between a variety of actors, collaborations to really adequately support and build that important institutional context. And that it would partnerships, that innovation is not just about technology, and it's critical to see innovation across those collaborations and relationships in a value chain also. So I'm not doing a good job of showing you the innovations we came up with, but maybe I'll just end as we're looking through these by just saying, so why do this kind of work? And for this was a very key moment where you're dealing with the question of the future of agriculture in Africa and how agriculture is a key engine of economic growth. It has been in the past, and it has that potential in Africa. And it's important to be influencing those kind of conversations. And agriculture, it's a prime opportunity to be able to influence those kind of discussions. So I think for both organizations, it was just seen as a very key, very politically relevant moment to seize and take advantage of. So just a few. This is a program that covers about 4 different countries in West Africa. It developed the ability of even farmers to breed seed and then become sellers of seed. This is a knowledge information platform around production of maize. And then finally, this one may be controversial ones in the series. We, even within OXFAM, as we had done this work with CGGC, and we were having these innovations vetted in terms of the analysis that we provided. We did have a lot of discussion internally about the contract farming and just this idea of these big nuclear farms coming and setting up and their value. But this one is an example. The example company is Olam, that is working in Nigeria as part of the Ministry of Agriculture, the president's agenda to make Nigeria self-sustainable in rice. And this is one of the strategies that they're using, supporting the very large farms that have then outgrower schemes, and that the ideas that those benefits should reach smallholder farmers also. So let me leave it at that and turn it over to Ajmal.
Thank you, Kimberly. In the beginning, I'd like to welcome Kimberly and Peter to Duke University, and also welcome everyone to this seminar. My presentation will be looking in the beginning briefly over the highlights from the agricultural innovation systems in global value chain frameworks and other conceptual frameworks. I will try to be brief and then move on to some of the high-level findings from the case studies, and then conclude my presentation with some of the overarching themes from our research. Our research goal was to identify innovations across agricultural value chains that supported market access for smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. And because there are a variety of definitions for innovation, and the term is a buzzword now, and there are different typologies of innovation, in order to identify relevant types of innovation and come to a workable definition for innovation for the purpose of this project, we conducted a lit review of the agricultural innovation systems and global value chain framework to bring together principles and concepts from these two theories to define innovations and the relevant typologies of innovation for the project. And then based on that, we developed a two-stage screening methodology for identifying cases and also evaluating those cases based on a set of criteria that we developed from the literature review. And then we come up with 120 innovations based on available material online, and filtered those 120 into top 13 innovations, applying those criteria. Then our colleagues from OXFAM America went down to field to actually verify our assumptions and findings and collect further information in that regard. So let me briefly touch about how perspectives on agricultural innovations has evolved over the past few decades since 60s and the time of Green Revolution. And this is not about a particular country or a particular continent, it's in general. And how disregarding market incentives actually led to failure of some of the original or traditional approaches to agriculture innovation. Starting in 1960s and 70s, the National Agricultural Research Systems had that top-down technology supply push model where agricultural research institutions working with universities were developing improved crop varieties and then passing these technologies to extension departments who in turn worked with farmers for adoption. The limitation of NARS system in terms of meeting the technology needs of farmers and addressing their productivity challenges led to the emergence of AKIS, which attempted to develop connection, establish communication between farmers as technology users and universities and research institutions as technology developers. But this model also emerged during the time where policy liberalization and all of those contextual changes were happening. And the AKIS system also disregarded market and exclusively focused on actors and processes in the rural environment. It succeeded to increase productivity, but because supply of food increased and there wasn't a market dimension included in the model, that led to collapse of markets and drop in food prices, and again, disincentivized adoption of technologies for farmers. And early 2000s, the AKIS was somehow led to emergence of agricultural innovation systems, which emphasizes markets and market incentives for technology adoption and brought in private sector and focuses on these multi-stakeholder platforms or innovation platforms, and thinks about innovation as building innovation capacity in the system and also of individual actors rather than considering technology as a center or pillar of innovation. And AIS is defined as a network of organizations, enterprises, and individuals focused to bringing new products, processes, and new forms of organization into economic use. So with that, I'd like to briefly touch on agricultural value chain framework and some of the similarities and differences between the two concepts and how they can strengthen each other moving forward. Agricultural value chain framework is also similar to AIS, a systemic perspective. And an agricultural value chain is defined as a production system involving various social and economic actors, and also the full range of activities that takes a agricultural product from production in the field to final consumption. But unlike AIS system, agricultural value chain framework emphasizes also governance, which is overlooked by the AIS system, which is critical in terms of setting priorities for innovation in a sector, and also determining who can participate in the system and who is marginalized. And looking at this governance and power relations between actors, the GVC framework also has a lot to say in identifying entry and leverage points for change in the system. Building on these principles, we came up with a conceptual model here that how these power relations and how the systemic perspective can help identify the types of innovations and also define innovation into connecting smallholders to farmers. In practice, various chain-like systems exist, and they are organized and under different structures, governance systems, and also actor relations differ. Not only saying that the types of markets in terms of opportunity for value addition and in terms of buyer requirements and stringency of those requirements. In the higher value markets, actors are typically connected to producers or suppliers, especially smallholders, through intermediaries, exporters, processors, aggregators, and Peter's presentation as talking about cassava processing will clarify some of those points. Buyer specification is very important to access markets. And even then, buyers in the higher value markets decide who to supply from among these different supplier groups based on their total cost of procurements, even when all these actors meet their specifications. And the total cost of procurement includes selling price, which includes production and transaction costs faced by producers, and also buyers' own transaction costs in dealing with the specific groups of producers or suppliers. So looking at these variables, we identified that smallholders were less competitive in all pre-production and in all post-production transactions because of the small-scale nature of their supply and demand. So that led us to formulate these typologies of innovation beyond production estate, looking at the input markets, looking at the output markets, and how smallholders, farmers played in those chains. This is how we defined the different types of innovations across the value chain, which includes process innovation, market innovation, service innovation, product innovation, organizational innovation, and policy innovation. And this is how we thought that these innovation types are distributed across the chain, and where would be some of the entry points and leverage points or actors to engage to promote these types of innovations. And we defined innovations as the use of new technologies, new ideas, new processes in a place where people have not used them before. So with this definition, we brought in the element of context, that if a certain type of innovation was adopted and developed in Ghana 2 years before, 2 years later, that type of innovation developing in Eastern Africa, in Rwanda, was still considered a valid innovation to include in our screening. And that was also led by the distinction between invention and innovation, which is actually the application of invention. So based on these conceptual framework, we developed our criteria, and now I'll briefly highlight some of the case study findings. As Kimberly indicated also in her presentation, we identified 120 innovations across different regions in Africa and across different product categories. And coming down to this top 13 innovation was an exhausting task. And because CGGC is engaged in client-oriented research, so it wasn't a purely economic, academic research, we need to consider client perspectives also in coming up with the top 13 innovations. So this slide basically indicates or reaffirms our assumptions in developing the conceptual framework. As you can see, a lot of the innovations are happening in pre-production and post-production stages of the chain. That's how you reduce transaction costs of smallholders, and that's how we empower them to partner in these chains and be included in agricultural value chains. So from these 13 innovations, this slide indicates how innovation types were distributed across how innovation cases, those 13 innovation cases were distributed across innovation types and across the value chain. For example, out of the 13 innovations, 11 of them had service innovations. And in terms of distribution across the chain, 3 cases had service innovation in pre-production, production, and post-production. And that's how you see that box drawn across the chain. 3 cases had innovations, service innovations in pre-production and post-production stages of the chain. And see those 2 boxes connected with a dashed line. And then 5 innovations, 2 of them in pre-production, 2 in production, and 1 in post-production stages. So, in terms of combining the concepts from AIS, Agricultural Innovation Systems, thank you, and Global Value Chain Framework, we also found out that all these agricultural development projects or innovation cases were working to build innovation capacity of smallholders by building a scale, by improving their access to affordable finance, by building their technical and business skills, and by engaging them into value chain linkages, develop their linkages or connect them with input and product markets. And as Kimberly mentioned, this requires innovative ways to intervene and develop these innovation capacities for smallholders because of those pre-production and post-production costs. And these cases at innovative ways of leveraging ICT, new financial products, and new operational models to deliver finance to farmers, and also alternative ways of organizing farmers at the production stage, and also thinking about organizing the chain vertically from research to final market. And I won't go into details of these specific cases, but Peter's presentation will highlight very detailed case-specific material related to these high-level findings. So in the next two slides, I'll conclude my presentation. As the agricultural value chain framework and the AIS system framework emphasizes this systemic perspective, thinking about input and product markets, thinking about market incentives for driving technology adoption. All of these cases had a very interesting way of operationalizing these theoretical or conceptual framework in the field by establishing what they, in some cases, call them innovation platforms. They brought in stakeholders across the chain together, engaged them into discussion, and leveraged their capabilities to establish a system that was functional. And these innovation platforms were effective, particularly when incentives and capabilities were developed in a balanced manner across the chain. As we saw in the agricultural innovation perspectives, the early perspectives were focusing more on building productive capabilities. Sorry, I'm forgetting about these slides.
You're human, don't worry.
And forgetting about market incentives. I was recently in Burundi, and there in Africa, there are these regional trade agreements and regional community blocks that are being developed. And there's been a lot of emphasis over the past few years to see how those trade channels could be established. They established the channels. And the person who was leading this project said that, a metaphor example, that all those efforts seemed like establishing a water supply system where there's no water. So they have all those trade competitiveness dimensions in place, but productive capacity is forgotten. So having balanced incentives and capabilities in the chain was important. And second, that these innovation platforms did not emerge automatically or by accident. Facilitation was required. And to a large extent, international development organizations were undertaking this facilitative role, and they were investing in that. But something that was very complicating in innovating, in establishing these innovation platforms was related to staple crops and commodity crops across Africa, rather than for export crops, where lead firms then emerged to take that role. And a practical challenge there in terms of engaging in this facilitative role is also because how donor funding models are established. In terms of accountability, they require their implementing partners to have hard outputs so they can measure them. So what development partners are doing, they are developing their project proposals in response to those call for proposals, distribution of X metric tons of wheat seed, and supporting establishment of this number of nurseries. They're taking the role of the private sector, and they are engaging into this service delivery simply because the funding model is wrong at the top, although donors are talking a lot about engaging private sector in these development interventions. And the difficulty is that this facilitation and transaction aspect is a soft indicator, and it's difficult to measure and establish accountability mechanisms. How donors can agree to a funding level with an NGO or partner simply to do facilitation, how you measure that effort. And that leads to a lot of challenges and a lot of crowding out of private sector on the ground. And I would like to refer to a concrete example from my experience in Burundi, where I was there early February. A company was established there with private fund, a small business, to develop banana saplings using tissue culture technology. And it had developed connections with the university in Belgium and with the university in India, and established that capabilities and has recruited 80 staff. Suddenly, a development partner comes there with the donor funding and starts distributing banana saplings for free, and simply runs this company out of business. And just over 6 months after they started this distribution, it downsized the staff from 80 to 25. That's how things are happening on the ground. And I think that's how a GVC framework, identifying these actors, because I would not be surprised that this development partner was not aware that a company existed there developing these banana saplings. So you need to identify these actors along the chain and see how that systems could be work together. And secondly, intermediary organizations are crucial to establishing this facilitation across the chain. And I think Peter's presentation again would clarify that. But to a large extent, development partners receiving donor funding are disregarding these intermediary organizations or firms that are working in processing, in aggregation, or export for a wide variety of reasons, historical reasons, and how private sector is perceived. And it's not always possible to establish innovation platforms. There's always asymmetries of interests, assets, power relations that prevent a true partnership from developing. So that again brings in the element of context based on our conceptual models, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. You have to look at structure of value chains in a particular context, identify actors, identify the relationships and governance patterns, and then see where are the gaps that can be filled. And just the final point, that in terms of operationalizing these principles, agricultural innovation systems and GVC framework, little actually has been done on the ground in terms of monitoring and evaluating those development programs and seeing how these upgrading strategies and how some of the recommendations coming out of research in these fields actually play on the ground. And a lot of research, as I indicated earlier, was on export crops. As cities in Africa are growing, there is a lot of potential to look now inside Africa for markets and look at those other crop categories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajmal. Thanks. So before turning to Peter, I just wanted to put in context what Ajmal was describing was this process of trying to go from a lot of potential innovations, 120, and screening it down to 13, and using these frameworks and concepts like global value chains, innovation platforms, et cetera. But Kimberly mentioned something very important. When we got to the 13, how do we know what's really happening on the ground? So OXFAM then sent in a team to go to each of the countries where these innovations were most prominent, that included not just OXFAM researchers, but journalists and photographers, to try to bring to life what was going on. So when you went from 13 to 8, you really needed to bring in a lot of other criteria. And then when you get to those 8, then you have to have people like Peter Bolt who have to get their hands dirty in these actual innovations and show how things work. So we wanted to anchor Peter, hands dirty, feet in the muck, or whatever sort of metaphor. Peter has so much practical experience in these countries that we wanted to be sure to have somebody who could talk about a particular innovation, and the cassava innovation Peter did, I think has really got enormous transformative potential. So Peter, why don't you
For this one.
say a few words and you'll talk on that one and then we'll open it up for questions.
Hello. Yes. Everybody wakes up, please. You had the starters, you had the main course, now you're getting the sweets. And hope that the sweets are not too vinegary. It's nice to be in a building where not the power is cut off every 5 minutes. And you talk and you talk and you talk and bang, bang, bang. So that's very nice to start with. I've always been in Africa, so I'm a bit different from the American tribe. I've lived my whole life in Africa, and so if I do strange things, don't get excited. That's the way I am. Yeah. Thank you very much, Gary, for inviting me. I find that an honor. I even came out yesterday from Joburg, all the way to Amsterdam, all the way to here. That tired, but I think it's an opportunity to talk to people and to tell a story, which I think a story should be told about Africa. There's nothing romantic about smallholder farmers, I can assure you. If half of your children die before the first year, and you have to live without Walmart around the corner where you can buy your one bar or your, what, I don't know what you eat in this country, but what I've seen up to now was not too fantastic. But these guys have to take their food out of the soil and they have to work, and if they don't get it, they die. As simple as that. And so I think, and I thank you, Kimberly, for stating that motivation of working in Africa is that the people who have nothing, the 80% who go to bed without food, I think is a powerful motivation. So I'm a private sector company because I got very dissatisfied with government. I worked for 19 years with government, then I worked 19 years for the private sector, and I got then very fed up with the private sector and decided to make a mix of the two, and that was DADTCO. Don't ask me that name. The name was established by one of my shareholders, being my brother, because if you start working in Africa and agriculture, there's nobody willing to finance you. Only friends, fools, and family are willing to put up the money. And the only reason they put up the money is that let him please go back to Africa. If not, he will be ashamed to the whole family when he stays in Holland. And so let's be honest about that. I'm motivated by the fact that people suffer. I'm motivated by the fact that there are a lot of people, especially in Africa, who have no future at all. And I think you are researchers. I'm not, I did my university degrees. But I think above all, you must work to try and improve the sort of other people. That is what motivates me. And in government, I've seen that people are very interested in their own things and a very short-term view. In private sector companies, it's the same. Managers will only look at their spreadsheets, the terrible Excel spreadsheet, which has wasted the whole world. And they look at it and they say, okay, I want to make so much money today. This is a small introduction. I'm a practical guy, so I'm not at your level. I'm going down Swedes to primary school level now. Yeah, but what I think I can tell you is that Africa has a great future, and that if we put all of our hands together, then it can make that we can make that happen. Unfortunately, the last 40 years, I've been 42 years working in Africa now, has not changed anything at the rural areas. We have spent billions and billions and trillions of dollars and euros, and I've only seen these 80% smallholder farmers reversing, going back instead of going forward. And I think that is a shame, and that is what the European and American people should understand. That how is it possible that after all this aid, and aid is big business, you've heard from Ajmal, how is it possible that these people are still where they started 40, 50 years ago? We can talk about it, we can talk about science, and we can talk about it, but the fact is that it must change. Okay, that was a small introduction to wake you up. And let's go to the presentation. You want to push the button? Well, let me do it. I love gadgets. That's, gadgets are for men, not for women. Very quickly, company profile. I'm Dutch. I was born and bred in Indonesia as a son of cocoa farmers, colonials. My family has been abusing Indonesia for the last 350 years. And I was the last one, so I can look back and say, that was not done, Boris. That was not very proper. I lived very shortly in Holland. I did my studies in Holland, and I decided to go to Africa because I think that a former colonial should not go back to his old colony, because the relationship between people is then, how do you call it in English, chargé, loaded. That's not good. I better work in Africa than I work. I never went back to Indonesia. I worked for the government of Holland, which is a big donor, which is now changing, for 19 years, also as a food security advisor to the minister in Holland. I then worked for the private sector, a trading company, for about 19 years, and still in Africa. And I found out that both of them had specifics which I didn't like. Short-term view, political expediency, American influence a lot in the Dutch government. And we are very obedient boys with the American government. And a lot of things were not to my liking. So I decided in 2002 to create Dutch Agricultural Development, because I thought it would be possible to create a situation in Africa where most of the population who had nothing could be presented with a possibility to create a future for them. And I've worked in many countries in Africa, but most projects I did was, you do rice in Mali, or you do rice in Cameroon, or you do rice in Senegal, you do rice in Ivory Coast. You help a few people, and that's it. There is no scale in the thing. So when I had the chance to resign from my company, which was a joyful moment to resign and say, thank you, bye, I don't want to work for you anymore. It gives you a big release in life. I decided to create that company and to look at the possibility of having a crop which would make it possible to give not only some farmers in Mali, but all of the farmers in Africa a future. And that's why I created DADTCO, and to please my shareholders, I've made it a social enterprise. I still don't know what that means by that, but I think the social enterprise should be in your heart and should not be in your website. That's how it goes. We chose cassava as the crop because cassava in sub-Saharan Africa is the root crop that everybody grows. And I don't know whether they are like me. I've got the wrong paint job, but I'm from Africa. You're from Africa? Nigeria, now. So where are they from in Nigeria? Yoruba? Igbo? From Enugu? Imo State, Anambra State, yes. Bad people, I tell you. They like money too much, Igbo. That's what we say in Nigeria. But every African has cassava in his genes. And if you look at East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, you will find a lot of maize. I hate maize because it is a very difficult crop. But all of those people still will go back to cassava, because cassava is the only crop in sub-Saharan Africa where people, whatever happens to their crops, they will have a crop in cassava. If the maize is devastated, if the groundnuts are devastated, cassava is always there. And that's what an African chief will tell you. Whatever happens to us, we still have cassava. And that's very important. Let me link back practically to, I'm working for SAP Miller, a beer company. I don't know whether anybody's anti-alcohol here. I don't drink alcohol, but might be the case. And this company is run by South Africans, white South Africans. It's a bit of an apartheid bulwark, we say. And they decided to localize their raw material to make beer, because to make beer you need sugars, and to make sugars you need starch. And they decided to go and work with us on cassava. And they could not believe that the African nation where they started working, Mozambicans, that from president down to the farmers said, this is our beer. We made a beer with 70% cassava in it, which is like Heineken or any of the other beers you can find. It's a clear lager. But the sense of ownership of these Africans for that beer was enormous. So the company had decided only to sell the beer in the rural areas, and the president told them to bring it to the towns. He said, you can bring barley from France or from Canada or the United States and make your own beer, but this is our beer. So you cannot tell us that our beer cannot be sold in the cities. As simple as that. So it gives the very strong linkage between a crop and the people. And people often forget that. And that that certain things like land ownership, and a crop like cassava is part of the culture, is part of the life. And that's a very strong and powerful connection. Now, this is also for my shareholders. DADTCO's ambition is to become the leading cassava flour. Cassava, we are concentrating, we are only focusing on cassava. We are working at the moment in 4 countries in Africa. We only focus on cassava. My specialty is rice, by the way, but we are only focusing on cassava. And I think that my shareholders should focus on one thing, is how the hell do we get those people from here to there? And whether they make money doing that or they don't make money doing that doesn't matter. The result is the most important thing. That's what this social enterprise stands for. Anybody doesn't know starch? I made a small slide. Starch, photosynthesis. Anybody still knows what that is? Yeah? So you get glucose. Glucose in your leaves is transported down into your roots, and in your roots, glucose are built all together. The dear Lord binds them together, and you make starch granules. Starch granule is nothing else but an aggregate of thousands of millions of glucose. Humans use starch, and we have alpha amylase in our spit. We have acid in our stomach. And if you look at starch factories in the world, they copy the human being. It's alpha amylase and an acid treatment. And we turn it again into glucose. And if you know what happens to glucose, look at my tummy, you know exactly where it goes. I think that people rarely know that starch is a major commodity in the world. America, for example, is the largest starch producer in the world on corn. You're even making bioethanol out of it, which is crazy, of course, but that doesn't matter. And whatever you touch in life, whether it is your clothes, it is Coca-Cola, it is your Mars bar, it is paper, it is everything contains starch. It's one of the major commodities in the world. Very hidden, but one of the major commodities. And there are, of course, a few American companies who are very great: Cargill, ADM, Ingredient, which is the former Corn Products International, CPI. 75 million tons of starch. Now, it's equivalent to about 400 million tons of crops. In the US, corn. In Europe, potatoes and wheat. In Asia, a lot of rice and cassava. I think that cassava is the best crop ever in starch because we produce potatoes under the subsidy regime, starch potatoes in Holland. We have 4,800 farmer families who receive 543 million euros of subsidy per year, product support, which is totally crazy. And if you want to talk about sustainability, the same minister in Holland who talks about sustainability for Africa then gives 534 million euros subsidy to 4,800 farmers. So you have to look at that. Starch is coming from sunshine, photosynthesis. So you see that starch, the best starch in the crop is cassava. We have varieties developed by the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, funded by Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, will go up to 35% starch. A starch potato in Europe will have maybe 16% due to that photosynthesis. So it's a bit crazy if you talk about local for local, if you talk about efficient production is to subsidize starch potatoes in Europe, while you can grow 4 times more starch and 3 times more starch in Africa. It's the same price and without subsidies. I just put here a small slide. Sub-Saharan Africa is producing 120 million tons of starch, cassava roots. Asia, which is the largest producer of starch and exporter of starch, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, they are big producers of starch. China is a big producer of starch, only doing 75. In Africa, 0 kilos are processed. All of the cassava which is grown is either wall-mort in the soil, where you keep your stock, or it is used for personal consumption, subsistence farming. Very quickly, major commodity, best starch crop, no processing, only subsistence crop, like I said. And I believe that crop is, I believe 10 years ago that crop was the crop to really revolutionize Africa's agriculture. That would be, I believe, and I still strongly believe that would be the crop which would show the world that Africans are very much capable of doing very good agriculture at smallholder level, and prove to the world that they were not, only hungry and dying and famine and war and corruption. And I live in Nigeria, and that is famous for corruption, but I've never seen it. That is, but then I need glasses, I think. Yeah. And when you look at the reason, when we looked at the reason, why is Africa, or why is cassava has not become a major crop in processing in Africa, we found out very quickly that it was impossible to bring cassava roots from the farmers, smallholder farmers, all of them, to a centralized processing plant. And you saw that Europeans and also Americans had put processing plants in Africa, which were based on highly developed infrastructural things, economy of scale. Cargill at the moment is looking at a 250,000 tons starch plant in Nigeria. I don't think they will even come further than the doorstep, because it will not happen. And we found out very quickly that if you want to do cassava and turn it into starch and substitute imports, you have to bring the processing to the farmer's level. Cassava is a crop which you pull out of the ground, 48 hours it is gone, starts spoiling. And there is no way you can get enough roots to a factory to be able to process it. And that's where the innovation come in. And let me put that the innovation was not our target. Our target was to reach the farmers. And the innovation was only a technical tool. And technology should always be a tool. You will never see me with an apple. Good. So we developed, in the last 10 years, we developed this technology, and there you see that technology available in the world is based on European technology or is based on American technology, all on economy of scale. And it is very difficult. It's very easy to go and scale up from 100,000 tons to 1 million tons in processing, but to go from 100,000 tons to about 2,000 tons is nearly impossible. And it took us 7 million euros in real money, that is $10 million, in 10 years to get at last a solution to that. All my shareholders' money has disappeared into this in there. But they had too much money anyway, so it doesn't matter. If you look at drivers, and that is the AMPU technology, I've put some brochures here so that you have an idea of it. I'll show you some pictures later of it. What we said is, if we want to develop that cassava value chain in Africa, and we were targeting from day one the market of import. Africa, while it is the largest cassava starch producer in the world, in principle, in root size, but not in processing, is also the largest starch importer in the world. It imports most of its starch needs from America, either wheat, 20 million tons per year, or it imports starch and starch derivatives like glucose syrup, fructose syrup, commercial starch, etc. And we were targeting that market. We also saw that cassava is on a constant increase. As soon as an economy develops like it did in China, you see that starch demand is very sharply increasing. That's not only meat, but it is also starch. If you look at the moment I think that China had 20 years ago had nearly no starch processing factories. Today, it's one of the major starch producers of the world, together with the United States. I've done the drivers a little bit again, so there's a global increase of demand for starch, and there's also cassava is an ideal starch crop. And the nice thing about cassava is you cannot do it in plantations. You cannot do large-scale farming of cassava. Cassava is a crop which is multiplied by stems, by cuttings. You only have about 10,000 plants per hectare. If you lose 30% because of mechanical planting, you lose 30% of your crop, as simple as that. And you see it is also in the humid tropical areas of Africa, it is the ideal smallholders crop. And I think that is a very important mechanism that you didn't mention, but if you tackle a crop and you want to work with smallholder farmers because they're your target, not because of romantic ideas, but because of necessity, tackle the crop that people cannot do on large-scale farms. That gives the smallholder farmer enormous advantage. I'll give you a practical example. In Nigeria, we do, with smallholder farmers, in the second year, we go up to 60 tons per hectare. The white Zimbabwean farmer kicked out by Bob Mugabe, who works in Nigeria, gets 15, 16 tons per hectare. And the simple reason is that he cannot spend the money and the time on the crop which is needed. And the smallholder farmer with 10 family members can send his boy into the, his boys and his girls into the land, and they will take replacing dead sticks and putting new sticks, etc. So for me, it was a fantastic crop to work with. I hope I'm not confusing you. And I think, Ajmal, you mentioned it, what we found out very quickly, but we knew already, is that if you want to work successfully in Africa, you have to work with all the actors in the value chain. All of our operating companies in Africa are owned partly by governments, local governments. And my managers often tell me, Peter, why the hell did you want to work with government? Government is terrible. I said, try to stay out of government and then see what happens. And we did that once, and it was a total disaster. You must have that stakeholder, because these governments are interested in developing their rural areas, because they need the votes today because of democracy. So you must have them in. You must be able to work with donors. Now, working with donors is hell, because donors are top down. They will tell these bloody Africans how to do the job, and why did you do it wrong? We told you already 20 years ago how you should do it. You're still not learning. And at the same time, they're making their own mistakes at home. But that's very difficult to work with. You talk to USAID, and USAID will give you a logical framework, and you have to report. Indeed, I've had so many farmers meetings. I said, but that is not the way it operates, guys. Yeah, but we have to explain that to our taxpayers. I said, explain to your taxpayers that you're honestly, genuinely trying to develop people, and that you're not a bookkeeper, but you're trying to develop people. And as long as those people develop, you have to prove all the proof you need to show that you're doing a job. I would run away with the money straight away, but that's another story. You also have to work with NGOs, and that's the worst case. Because NGOs are donor suckers. And they will do anything the donor tells them, as long as they get the money. And there is no bigger business than NGO business. And I'm not talking about OXFAM. I'm talking... Of course. Have you seen how she slaps? Bang. But NGOs are, at the moment, a plague in Africa. In every country, you will find 2,000 to 3,000 NGOs. So it's very difficult to distinguish between the bad ones and the good ones. I worked with an American international NGO, IFDC, International Fertilizer Development Center in Alabama. It's a big one, gets a lot of money, and I kicked them out last year for the simple reason that they were only focusing on their reporting, and whatever they did in the field didn't matter. They had to report in a certain way to the donor, in this case the Dutch government, who asked them, have you met so many farmers in that date, in this month? And it's incredible. So I said to them, I'm sorry, we cannot continue like that. But it is extremely important when you work in Africa that you work with these guys, because they're also an actor in the value chain. It's extremely important also to work with embassies and with World Bank. I hate World Bank personally, but to work with World Bank. 3 minutes, I need another 30. So what I wanted to say in general is there are so many actors and so many important people. To work with universities is important, because universities are very good in dreaming up policies, let them parachute them down, and then maybe they will find somewhere on the ground, they will find somebody who tells them, look, I think you should change this, should change that. But for us, they're very important. One of the major things we did in Africa is explaining to governments, if you want to increase local production and you want to bring wealth to your farmers, you must protect those farmers against certain organizations, private sector companies, political unwilling people, etc. And I'll come back to that later. Because in Africa, you see that most of the staple commodities are imported. They're not produced locally. And the people doing the import make a lot of money out of the imports. And they don't want local production to happen. So you need people like World Bank, IMF, IFC, all of them, embassies, I talk a lot of time with ambassadors, explain that that must change. And then certain people, like in Nigeria, where you have a guy importing 2 million tons of wheat, making about $1 billion per year net profit on that wheat. He's not waiting for somebody to tell him to replace that wheat with bloody cassava flour. But then you must have a president who is willing to take the risk and say, okay, I'll stop that. Here is the famous AMPU. Don't ask me how we got the name. That was somebody in the company again, this Autonomous Mobile Processing Unit. We put it on a 40-foot trailer truck. It contains a miniature cassava processing, wet processing plant. So the starch coming out of that can compete with any starch in specifications in the world. Very expensive, but we have built about 20 of them now. They're operating all over Africa. And most of them are working for the beer industry. A lot of beer people are going for localization. And we work also for people like Unilever, Nestle, where we deliver starch to their, seasoning cubes, Maggi, how do you call them? What you put in your soup is bouillon, yes. Yeah, which is 25% starch, 50% salt, and then some other things. So that machine is our innovation, but again, there's a lot of emphasis on the technology, but in reality, the technology is just a tool to reach the farmer. And I want to emphasize that again. When we work in the field, a machine like that circulates in an area of about 200-300 kilometers in 6 different areas. We call them platforms. And on each platform, we have a complete team. So we do extension, we do organization, we do yield increases. We make sure that those farmers are very well guided into the work. Not like the tobacco companies do, where the farmer is put by his head, told to do this day, that, and they have a whole system of. We work with independent farmers. So if a farmer tells me to go and take a hike, I take a hike. We oblige ourselves to buy from farmers. We do not oblige farmers to buy from us. You had an example of Olam in Nigeria. Olam had a contract with farmers, and the farmers did not supply to Olam the rice they had promised, but Olam's price was lower than the market. He got the Nigerian police to collect 200 farmers, put them in jail. Now, the one police force in the world which is corrupter than anything else in life is the Nigerian police force. So you cannot say you work with farmers and then lock them up. That's impossible. So any farmer who wants to sell his cassava to my competitor is welcome. Then I will drive the competitor off the road, don't worry. But you have an idea what we built around such a supply chain. We one of the most important departments in our company is supply chain management, where people from who have worked a lot in Africa are doing nothing else but trying to reach that farmer in time. Some of our business model, just to show you, we produce, we take cassava roots, we call that cassava cake. And then the cassava cake is the material we use for all our other products. So it's either starch, flour, goes to beer directly, bioethanol production in Mozambique. We produce syrup, sorbitol for toothpaste, chewing gum, etc. And there's an endless stream of products you can make out of starch. I think very important. One of the most fantastic persons I've met in my life in Africa is the current Minister of Agriculture, a very famous man, but a very good man. We say, look, we spend about $12 billion per year on food imports. And one of the most famous imports in Nigeria is Pringles. Everybody eats Pringles here. And you can go to any village in Africa and you buy Pringles. And you put 1.7 tons of Pringles in a 40-foot container. Now, that's just to mention this here, it's enough to get completely red in the face of shame. Why should people eat Pringles? I know why I like it very much, but yeah. And what is making Pringles so savory is that they put phytin in it, monosodium glutamate, and ammonium sodium glutamate is again made out of starch. So this minister has decided, he said, look, the only way I can afford, I can get my local producers, my local farmers working, is to protect them against the monopolistic, oligopolistic importers which are sitting at my coastline and which control my party and which control my president by big bribes. $12 billion of imports in foodstuffs in a country like Africa. A non-indigenous crop like wheat, 4 million tons per year. Bought in Tampa, Florida for $300 per ton FOB, sold to his own company in Nigeria for $700 per ton. So all the money flows out of the country by those imports. And those people, and you will find them everywhere in Africa, sitting on the coast, are controlling and stopping local production. I wanted to go 0 minutes.
Yep.
And a one in front. Okay. Let me go very quickly. We target input substitution. We do a lot of political work as a private company, trying to convince ministers like ministers of finance and ministers of agriculture that there is a huge future for them if they go and support their local farmers. I think I'll leave this one out. Social context. I think very important point is that we guarantee farmers, we work in an area, we guarantee farmers income. So we tell farmers, whatever you bring to us, we'll buy. If you don't want to bring it somewhere else. Now, partnerships, farmers, most important, governments, NGOs. So while you say it is a necessary evil, we still have to work with governments and we have to work with NGOs. They are partners in the chain. Our major client, and I'll go very quickly now because I have 0 minutes again, are the beer brewers. Well, use at the moment about, if you look at the production, 2 million tons of cassava roots per year if they do a proper job, substituting imported barley. 2 million tons of cassava is good enough for about a couple of million farmers. So you can really create wealth. Instead of farmers buying beer from imported French, Canadian, or American barley growers, they can have it from their own stuff. We produce at the moment 2 beers, Impala in Mozambique, and we produce Eagle in Ghana, and we're doing the same in Uganda, South Sudan, and Zambia.